India's history is often told in broad strokes. The rise of the Mauryas, the golden age of the Guptas, the power of the Mughals, the struggle against the British. But there is another history, hidden in the shadows, barely whispered in classrooms. A history of Africans in India, not as mere visitors, not as nameless slaves, but as rulers, generals, saints, sailors, and communities that still survive to this very day. From the slave soldier who defied the Mughals, to the African dynasty that ruled the seas of western India, to the forgotten Siddis villages of Karnataka and Gujarat. This is a history that will challenge everything you thought you knew about India's past. And let me tell you, the deeper we go, the more shocking it becomes. So stay tuned until the very end, because by the time this story concludes, you'll never see India's history, or Africa's, in the same way again. To understand Africa's place in India, we need to first cross the ocean. Not the Atlantic, but the Indian Ocean, the beating heart of trade and culture for over 2,000 years. Think of it. Long before Europe's age of exploration, African sailors, Arab merchants, Indian traders, and Chinese voyagers all rode the monsoon winds. In summer, the winds blew one way, in winter, the other. These winds were like nature's engine, carrying ships across thousands of kilometers. Archaeologists digging in East Africa have found beads from India dating back 2 millennia. Indian cotton cloth was treasured along the Swahili coast. Meanwhile, African ivory, tortoiseshell, and even giraffes appeared in Indian ports like Calicut and Cambay. This was no backwater. It was a global marketplace. So when Africans began arriving in India in greater numbers by the medieval period, they were not stepping into a foreign land. They were entering a space already shaped by centuries of contact. And crucially, Africans did not come only as slaves. They came as sailors, guards, mercenaries, merchants, people with skills and strength that made them indispensable in the courts of Indian rulers. Stay tuned, because one of those men would rise from slavery in Ethiopia to become the nightmare of the mighty Mughal Empire. His name was Malik Ambar, and his story is one of the most extraordinary tales in world history. When we hear the word slave, we often imagine hopelessness, chains, powerlessness. But in the medieval Islamic world, from Baghdad to Cairo to Delhi, slavery could sometimes be the beginning of power. Rulers imported enslaved boys from across the world, Turks, Persians, Central Asians, and Africans. These boys were often converted to Islam, trained as soldiers or palace guards, and if they proved loyal and talented, they could rise high. The Africans were known as Habshis or Abyssinians, and in India they gained reputations as fearless warriors and utterly dependable bodyguards. The Delhi sultans relied on them. African commanders led units of cavalry and infantry. Some rose to governorships, controlling land and collecting taxes. This wasn't unique to India. Think of the Mamluks of Egypt, slave soldiers who overthrew their masters and founded a dynasty. Or the Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire. The pattern was clear. Slaves could rise to power. In India, the stage was set for Africans to do the same. And when the Delhi Sultanate fragmented into regional powers, especially in the Deccan Plateau, Africans seized their chance. And no one did it more brilliantly than Malik Ambar. Picture this. A boy born in Ethiopia in the mid-1500s. His name was Chapu. As a child, he was sold into slavery. He crossed the Red Sea, passed through Yemen, and was eventually purchased by a merchant in Baghdad. From there, he was sold again, this time to an Indian noble in the Deccan region. That boy, Chapu, would become Malik Ambar. Now here's where the story twists. Instead of vanishing into obscurity, Ambar rose. Through charisma, intelligence, and sheer resilience, he climbed the ladder of power in the Ahmadnagar Sultanate. By the early 1600s, he was the de facto ruler of the kingdom. A former slave now commanded armies, levied taxes, and directed state policy. And then came his greatest test, the Mughal Empire. At this time, the Mughals were at their zenith. Emperor Akbar had expanded the empire further than any before him. His son, Jahangir, wanted to conquer the Deccan completely. But Jahangir ran into Malik Ambar. Ambar pioneered guerrilla warfare in India. His cavalry struck fast, burned supply lines, melted back into the hills. He fortified strongholds, built irrigation projects, and even designed the layout of Aurangabad, which later became the Mughal capital in the Deccan. Jahangir despised him. In fact, Jahangir commissioned paintings mocking Ambar as a black slave to humiliate him. But humiliation couldn't defeat him. Jahangir's armies failed, again and again, to crush Ambar's resistance. When Malik Ambar died in 1626, he had not only preserved the Deccan against Mughal conquest, he had become a legend. Think about that. An Ethiopian boy, sold as a slave, had risen so high that one of the most powerful emperors in the world considered him his greatest enemy. If you think that's the peak of Africa in India, you're mistaken. Because while Malik Ambar fought on land, Africans also ruled the seas. Off the coast of Maharashtra lies a fortress like no other, Janjira. Built on a rocky island surrounded entirely by the Arabian Sea, Janjira was practically impenetrable. And here's the stunning fact. Janjira was ruled by Africans. The rulers, known as Siddis, were descendants of Africans brought to India. They carved out their own dynasty, complete with nawabs, courts, and one of the strongest navies in the Indian Ocean. European powers came with their cannons. The Portuguese tried to take Janjira, and failed. The Dutch tried, and failed. Even the great Maratha leader Shivaji tried repeatedly to conquer the fort, but he too failed. Why? Because the cities of Janjira had mastered naval warfare. Their ships patrolled the Konkan coast. Their cannons roared across the waves. Their walls stood unbroken. For centuries, Janjira symbolized African resilience in India. A dynasty of African origin, defending its sovereignty against Europeans, Marathas, and Mughals alike. Even today, the ruins of Janjira whisper of a time when Africans commanded not just palaces, but oceans. And that's not all. Africans weren't just warriors and rulers. They also became saints, artists, and part of India's spiritual fabric. But before we get there, let's turn to another forgotten story: the women. Most of the time, when we hear about African history in India, we hear about men, soldiers, generals, rulers. But women were there too, and their stories are just as remarkable. Some African women were brought as attendants or slaves into royal households. But in India's fluid, diverse courts, marriage and political maneuvering opened doors. We know of African women who rose to prominence as landowners, courtiers, and even queens. They advised rulers, funded shrines, and left behind traces in inscriptions. Their histories are harder to uncover, often erased or overshadowed. but they remind us that Africa's influence in India wasn't only on the battlefield. It was also in the palace, in the household, in the rhythms of daily life. And this brings us to the most enduring legacy of all, the Siddhi communities of India. Who are the Siddis? The word Siddhi refers to the descendants of Africans who came to India centuries ago. Some were soldiers, some were rulers. Many were ordinary men and women who married into local communities and stayed. Today, Siddhis live in Gujarat, Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Hyderabad. Their numbers are estimated at around 200,000, and they carry a dual heritage: African ancestry, Indian culture. In Gujarat, the Siddhis are famous for the Dhamal dance, an electrifying performance with drums and rhythms clearly linked to African traditions. In Karnataka, Siddhi villages celebrate festivals that honor both African saints and Indian deities. Some Siddhis became celebrated athletes, representing India in hockey and athletics. Others continue oral traditions that link them back to Africa. But it hasn't been easy. Colonial rulers exoticized the Siddhis, treating them as curiosities. After independence, many lived in poverty, facing discrimination for their African features. And yet, the Siddhis survived. Their music, their dances, their stories, all testify to a resilience that echoes the spirit of Malik Ambar and the rulers of Janjira. If you've stayed with me this far, you'll want to stay tuned until the very end, because in Part 2, we'll explore how Africans became saints in India, how colonialism tried to erase them, and how their memory is being revived today. So far, we've seen Africans as warriors, rulers, and communities, but their story in India was also profoundly spiritual. Across Gujarat and Maharashtra, you will find shrines dedicated to African saints. These shrines are visited not just by Siddhis, but by Hindus, Muslims, and Christians alike. One such figure is Bava Gor, an African Sufi saint who is venerated in Gujarat. According to legend, he arrived in India from Africa centuries ago, spreading Islam but also embodying African spiritual traditions. To this day, pilgrims visit his shrine, tying threads, lighting lamps, and seeking blessings. Another is Siddhi Masood, remembered in Maharashtra as both a warrior and a saint. His shrine draws diverse communities who come seeking healing and guidance. What makes these shrines so fascinating is how they blur boundaries. They are not just Muslim, not just Hindu, not just African. They are uniquely Indian African, blending traditions into something new. And this tells us something profound. Africans in India were not outsiders to its religions. They reshaped them, adding their own rhythms, their own prayers, their own saints. Stay tuned, because next we'll see how colonial powers tried to erase these contributions, and how Africans fought back even then. When the British took control of India, they also took control of its history. Colonial historians had little interest in celebrating Africans in India. To them, Africans were curiosities, racial outsiders who didn't fit into their narrative of European superiority. So Malik Ambar was reduced to a rebel. The rulers of Janjira were dismissed as pirates. The shrines of African saints were ignored. At the same time, colonial policies impoverished Siddhi communities. Once powerful or respected, many were pushed into the margins, left landless and poor. The British classified them as tribals or outcasts, stripping away centuries of dignity. Missionaries often called their dances and rituals superstitions. Colonial officers described them in exotic, patronizing tones, reducing real history to spectacle. Yet even under colonial rule, Africans resisted. In the forests of India, some Siddis joined freedom struggles. Oral songs carried memories of resistance. Drums beat in secret, echoing the rhythms of survival. It seemed the gods of Africa had been silenced. But silence is not death. Silence is waiting. And as you'll see soon, after independence, memory began to awaken again. Here's something that makes this story even more fascinating. The relationship between Africa and India was not one-way. It was two-way. While Africans were arriving in India from as early as the 13th century, Indians were also migrating to Africa. During the 19th and 20th centuries, under British colonial rule, thousands of Indians were taken as indentured laborers to East Africa, to places like Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Others settled in Zanzibar, Mozambique, and South Africa as traders and shopkeepers. The result? Just as Africans shaped Indian history, Indians shaped African history. Gandhi began his political career in South Africa. Indian merchants dominated trade networks on the Swahili coast. The Indian Ocean was not a barrier. It was a bridge of constant exchange, of goods, of people, of culture. This makes the African presence in India not an anomaly, but part of a long tradition of interconnection. And if you're still watching, stay tuned until the end, because we're about to uncover the living legacy of these connections, the modern-day Siddhi communities. Today, the Siddis number about 200,000 across India. In Gujarat, they live in villages near Gir forest, famous for their Dharmal dance. In Karnataka, you'll find Siddhi hamlets where African drumming mixes with Indian rituals. In Maharashtra, Siddis preserve oral traditions linking them back to Janjira. Some Siddis look distinctly African, with curly hair and dark skin. Others, after centuries of intermarriage, look like their Indian neighbors. But all share a sense of unique heritage. Life hasn't been easy. Many Siddis live in poverty, facing discrimination and being treated as outsiders in their own land. For decades, their history was ignored. But things are changing. In Karnataka, Siddis are recognized as a scheduled tribe, giving them legal protections. Scholars are studying their culture seriously. Filmmakers are documenting their dances and stories. And some Siddis have risen to fame. In the 1980s, Rashidiyya Siddhi represented India in athletics. Others have excelled in hockey and football, their physical strength and agility celebrated on the field. Through sport, music, and religion, Siddis are reclaiming pride in their African past. And yet, challenges remain. Poverty, marginalization, and lack of awareness still haunt many communities. But the drumbeat is growing louder. The memory of Africa in India is stirring again. Let's return to two of the great symbols of Africa in India, Malik Ambar and Janjira. Today, the city of Aurangabad still carries traces of Malik Ambar's vision. The canals he built to bring water still exist. The forts he strengthened still stand. Local memory keeps him alive, sometimes in reverence, sometimes in silence. In Maharashtra, the ruined fort of Janjira still towers above the sea. Tourists come, often not knowing that it was once ruled by Africans. But the walls remember. The cannons remember. The waves that lapped against Siddhi ships remember. By remembering these figures, we restore not just their names, but the dignity of African contributions to Indian history. Stay tuned until the very end, because the conclusion of this story will bring everything together in one powerful message. One reason this history is so little known is because of how modern ideas of race developed. By the 19th century, European colonialists classified people into rigid racial categories. They argued that Africans were destined only for slavery, never for power. So they couldn't admit that Africans had once ruled forts and kingdoms in India. But medieval India didn't think that way. In Malik Ambar's time, race was not destiny. Loyalty, skill, and charisma mattered more. That's why an Ethiopian slave could rise to rule. That's why Africans could command armies, build cities, and be venerated as saints. Recovering this history breaks apart colonial lies. It shows us that Africa was not powerless, that Africans were not just victims, that they shaped empires, across oceans, and in remembering, there is power, because history is not just the past. It is identity. One of the most beautiful survivals of Africa in India is in music and dance. The Dhamal dance of Gujarat is thunderous, energetic, ecstatic. It is performed during festivals, accompanied by drums that echo unmistakably African rhythms. Siddis songs mix Swahili words with Gujarati or Marathi, a living reminder of journeys across the sea. In Karnataka, Siddhi communities celebrate saints with songs that carry African beats. And in sport, in hockey, football, athletics, Siddhis have carved out recognition. Many attribute their speed and stamina to their African roots. Every drumbeat, every dance step, every sprint on the field is a reminder. Africa is alive in India. So what does all this mean today? It means that the relationship between Africa and India is not new. It's ancient. It means that globalization did not begin with the British. It was already happening across the Indian Ocean 1,000 years ago. It means that Africans are not strangers in India. They are part of its story. Rulers, saints, warriors, farmers, dancers. And it means that identity is not fixed. It is woven, like a fabric, across oceans and centuries. As India and Africa strengthen ties today, in trade, in diplomacy, in culture, they are reviving a connection that goes back to the days of monsoon winds and sailing ships. We began this journey asking, what is India's African past? Now we know. It is the story of Malik Ambar, the Ethiopian slave who humbled the Mughals. It is the story of the Siddis of Janjira, whose fortress defied European conquest. It is the story of African saints whose shrines still glow in Gujarat. It is the story of Siddhi dancers, whose drums echo both Africa and India. It is the story of forgotten women who rose from slavery to queenship. It is the story of survival, erasure, and revival. The colonizers thought they had silenced these gods. They thought they had erased these rulers. But gods do not die. Memory does not vanish. Today, the African god in India is remembered. In songs, in shrines, in stories, in blood. And so we end with this. Africa in India is not a footnote. It is a chapter that once forgotten now returns. So stay tuned, because history like this doesn't end. It waits, like a drumbeat, for us to listen again.